Let's do it.
Okay, so I wanted to start with now I'm curious about what your approach is nowadays towards meditation. So is it simply something that you're trying to go deeper and deeper into? Is it some sort of a thing of turning up and being consistent about it and paying your dues to something? Or is it maybe something different about getting to a higher consciousness or trying to develop some sort of third eye?
Uh-huh. I think it's more of a combination of the first two things you said, um, which is partly, I mean, in monastic life, it's important not to, I don't know what the word is exactly. It's important not to be too emotional in spiritual life. And I mean emotional in a very specific way. Like, I think what happens with a lot of spiritual aspirants is they get like these momentary bursts of sort of enthusiasm or something, and then they like spend 6 hours in meditation, and then they get dry for a while. They don't do any meditation at all, and like that's problematic in monastic life. So it's very important for monks to stick with their meditation routine, regardless of whether they, their mind is restless or calm, or whether they feel like it or not. So that's kind of more along the lines of the first of the three things you mentioned, which is it's important to just keep up the routine. But of course, there's a danger that that routine becomes mechanical, and you're just doing it, as you said, to pay your dues, which is a funny way of putting it. But yeah, so the ideal is, of course, to deepen the meditation in the course of the practice, and to, in our tradition, our main meditation practice is what's called japa. It's mantra japa, which means mental repetition of a mantra given to us by our guru, while also concentrating on usually a form of your chosen deity and the form of God that you prefer to meditate on. So it's a kind of theistic, you can call it a theistic or devotional form of meditation. So the idea is, as you continue to meditate, you want to deepen that meditation. Try to concentrate on the form of God and the name of God as much as you can without distractions, without having the mind run off in other directions. And at the same time, have a certain feeling behind the practice. I mean, the practice should ideally be informed by what Sri Ramakrishna used to call a longing for God. If you've just met somebody you're in love with, you're going to think about that person constantly, just naturally. You don't need to actually like make an effort to think about that person, right? That's how we're encouraged to think of God and meditate on God, right? But that it's harder to love God in that same way, right? That's why it's so challenging. Spiritual life is so challenging. But that's the idea of meditation, is that it should not just be a mechanical practice, but it should be informed by, the Sanskrit term is bhava, or by a certain kind of a deep feeling for God. And if you have that, then the meditation becomes living and less mechanical.
Right. And so is it you focus on that sort of relationship with God and maybe getting closer, rather than letting your mind go other places and go on to maybe drifts with thoughts that come along?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so it's, Jesus said you can choose God or mammon, but not both. And in our scriptures, Vedantic scriptures, like the Kathopanishad, we're told the same thing, just in slightly different language. There are two paths that confront every spiritual aspirant, Shreya and Preya, or every human being, Shreya and Preya. Shreya means the path of spiritual perfection and enlightenment, and Preya is the path of enjoyment, worldly enjoyment. And you have to pick the one that you're committed to and try to stick to it, and make sure not to confuse one for the other. That's another big danger. I just gave a lecture on self-deception in spiritual life, where that was a prominent part of the discussion, where people think they're on the path of spiritual enlightenment, but they're actually it's a kind of pseudo-spiritual justification for engaging in worldly enjoyment.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I just watched that lecture actually.
Oh.
Was it like an hour long, and like there was a bit where you were about yoga, or is it ayoga?
Bhoga.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and I found that very interesting. It was Yeah, it's like if you're not going the spiritual path, then you're going the pleasure path and the materialistic path. Yeah.
Not just that, but the greater danger is you think you're going on the spiritual path when in fact you're going on the bhoga path, on the enjoyment path.
Mm.
And so Shankara says the first step in spiritual life is being able to clearly distinguish between these two paths. And I think a lot of people get stuck there, actually.
And what does distinguishing those two like mean to you? Like, what's your process of identifying like your own sort of desires and the way your mind can go astray at times? And how do you steer yourself towards the right path?
Yeah. So how do you clearly distinguish them? Well, first of all, you have to have a clear understanding of what these two paths involve, what they are. And the way I put it is the path of spirituality is the path of, there are different ways of putting it. Transcending or challenging or counteracting or diminishing egoism, selfishness. That might be a simple way of putting what being on the spiritual path is. And opening yourself to a higher self, higher spiritual possibilities. And the path of enjoyment is gratification of ego, aggrandizement of ego, and becoming more selfish rather than less selfish. So that, and then with regard to the second question, how do you, can you reiterate that second question? Because that was slightly different from the one I just answered.
Yeah, it was more about how do you personally keep yourself on that right path when you notice your mind going astray and things?
Sure. That's a great question. And I mean, there are different approaches, and the one that I prefer is prayer. I think it's very effective and sort of neglected in this day and age because people think it's old-fashioned or somehow, I don't know, based on blind faith, or you're talking to nobody and what's so. But no, I've always found it effective, and I think it's useful because it's a great way of sort of getting out of your head. And I think like another danger, and especially contemporary spirituality, is this obsession with self-effort. I can do everything on my own and this and that. And so prayer is a good way of kind of becoming humble and just acknowledging that there's a need to surrender to a higher power. Because if remember, the goal is to eradicate ego, then even self-effort in spiritual life could become a source of ego. That's a danger, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't try as hard as you can in spiritual life. But at the end of the day, it's by God's grace that we make spiritual progress.
I mean, something that I've found when I went into spirituality is like my ego kind of dissolves. And so I feel like everyone just on a total equilibrium. And I found that interesting that you can still have an ego with being spiritual. Because I think it was because you are spiritual and other people are not. So that you higher.
Spiritual ego is a great danger in spiritual life, especially if you give lectures like I do, or, there are different ways or you're wearing this, which is also, you can get monastic ego. There's so many ways of becoming egoistic in spiritual life. So there's so many different modes of self-deception, right? That's what I talked about in the lecture. That's one of them.
And how for you, do you decrease that ego? Is it kind of through your practices of meditation and just your kind of a way of approaching life?
Yeah, I mean, prayer, spiritual practice, but also mindfulness. I mean, I think part of the point of that lecture in self-deception was just like understanding the different ways that the mind can play tricks on you, that you can deceive yourself, and just like recognizing those mechanisms is itself empowering and helps you take a step back from those mechanisms, right? And not to fall prey to them in the future, right? So it's some combination, I'd say, of mindfulness and prayer that I think is especially effective in avoiding self-deception in spiritual life.
I'm thinking for sort of myself and Jacob and the people that will be like listening to this, do you think there are ways that we can apply this idea of like the importance of selflessness into the modern world that most people live in? Because I think the most important thing from this conversation is that people get an idea of how they can take your wisdom into their own lives. Because not everyone is going to be able to go down the monastic path, if you know what I mean. Like, and I'm thinking for myself, I agree and resonate with everything that you're saying, but I find it difficult to then go out into my life with all the sort of constraints and situations I'm in and maintain this kind of spiritual peace inside. So what advice would you give to someone like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to sort of inquire further into exactly where you're struggling to incorporate spirituality into your daily life. Because I know one thing, but yeah, please.
I can give you an example for me. So like I'm an athlete quite high up in my sport, and it's very difficult when you get, I play wheelchair basketball. Quite an interesting one. Yeah, a bit of an obscure one. But so I play I'm a part of the setup for the Great Britain under-22s team because I'm 19.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah.
And like when we get to a level like this, you have teammates, but in a way they are also your competitors, because you are competing for selection in teams and things like this. And I struggle to have this self-confidence in my own abilities to play for these teams and to contribute on the court effectively without that then branching into ego. And like, it seems like the stereotypical advice we're given is that having an ego, in inverted commas, is required because then you don't get walked over by everyone else. So that's my own personal example, but I think anyone could have that in their own lives. Like, how do they study but don't become egoic about their academic skills? And how do they be a great parent without taking so much pride in what their children do and then that fueling their ego? I think it's very difficult to go out in the world and try and be good at things and serve society without your ego creeping through the door, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful. And I think everybody struggles with that in different forms of work, walks of life. And so you gave a great example. I think the important thing is what Bhagavad Gita teaches, which is that whatever you do it as an offering to the divine instead of as a means of self-aggrandizement. So you play a particular sport at a very high level. First of all, try to think of that talent that you have, that you, I mean, to some extent probably born with, but that you ended up cultivating, obviously, as a gift from God. And I don't know to what extent you're theistic, you might be rolling your eyes, but I'm just giving you one example. It all depends on your temperament, but think about it as a gift from God. And when you engage in the sport, you also, in the midst of it, you try to take the ego out of the work, out of the activity, while at the same time maintaining enthusiasm. It sounds paradoxical, but in chapter 18 of the Gita, Krishna says, Mukta sango nahambadi dhripi utsaha samanvitaha siddhi siddhyo nirvikaraha karta satukam. It's a Sanskrit verse which goes as follows. And I think it might help you. You have to parse every word. How should you engage in these activities like wheelchair basketball or anything else, whatever you find, whatever duty is facing you in this world? It's not talking about monastic life. Krishna is telling Arjuna to fight in a massive war that's going to entail the death of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Okay. So it's a very practical text. He says, Mukta Sangaha, be free from attachment to what? Attachment to the work itself. So you should also test yourself. How attached are you to wheelchair basketball? Like, do you freak out if you're not able to play for a few days? If so, you might want to sort of re-equilibrate yourself in that regard. But also, are you attached to the fruits of the activity? And so there's a distinction here. What do the fruits mean? It means you're playing at a very high level. Now, how ambitious are you? How much of your motivation to practice at that high level and to engage in the sport has to do with going on to the Olympics, say, and then, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but the idea is, what's the purpose in going to the Olympics? Is it to get name and fame and recognition and to be famous and to have your name emblazoned on newspapers? Or to manifest the divine in you? Because again, Gita is very helpful in these regards. So chapter 10 of the Gita is all about how there's a verse toward the end which says, anybody who displays any exceptional skill or talent has a special manifestation of the divine in them. So that's a different way of thinking about playing a sport at a very high level, is that's a way of actually manifesting the divine in a special way. Okay, so coming back to the verse that I was talking about, right? That's just the first word, Mukta Sangaha. Try to be unattached to the work itself and to the fruits of the action. Mukta Sango, anahambadi. Try to take the ego out of the activity. I mean, look, I'm a fan of football, for instance. I used to watch basketball too, especially, I'm talking circa 1990s Michael Jordan. I loved watching basketball at that time. But you can tell immediately. And if you just compare world-class athletes in a given sport, some of them are far more egoistic than others. And I don't want to name, I'll name names who strike me as humble rather than on the other side, because that's mean. But like Lionel Messi seems to be on the humble side. Mohamed Salah. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, when they score a goal, they're pointing up and thanking God, as opposed to some of these other athletes who are just so, every time it's all about beating their own chest. And so even at that very high level, you can clearly see a distinction between people who are trying to take the ego out of what they're doing and those who are completely immersed in the ego. Okay, that's the second word. So free from attachment, be free from egoism, mukta sango anahambadi. And then here's the last part of the first line, which is really important. Vritti utsaha samanvitaha, which means you should at the same time be fully endowed with enthusiasm and perseverance. This is the paradox that I was talking about. Is that you're kind of thinking like, well, if I'm not attached to the work, then that sucks the sails out of the motivation. But no, you have to keep up the motivation, the enthusiasm, the perseverance. And in fact, if you do the karma yoga in the right way, this yoga of selfless action, you'll be even better at the sport. And now to the second line. Siddhi siddho nirvikaraha karta satguche. So the sattvika doer, the spiritual actor, agent, the one who can do work as karma yoga, is the one who is also equal in success and failure. This is a key test. And it's especially important in the context of sports. Because no matter how much you try, it's a team sport, which means even if you do your best, maybe it's a teammate that lets you down, maybe the other team is just superior to you, you lose. How do you take that? How do you take defeat in a game, failure, and even personal failure? Maybe you've just messed up and you feel bad about it. But there are different ways of handling that. If you're very egoistic about it, it means you become crestfallen, dejected, depressed for days. You can't get out of bed. But if you take it in a more spiritual way, you'll be able to take both success and failure in a more even-keeled way. So I hope that, sorry for the Sanskrit lesson there, but I think that it does help to actually parse each word of that verse.
No, that was a really, really nice frame and way of thinking about it. And you're so right that every time I feel disappointed with the game result or my own personal performance, it is all just a result of an expectation that my ego held. And I think my sort of modern day approach to things is I try and play basketball for playing basketball, not thinking about how I should be doing it and just doing it for the activity itself. And I quite like this frame that my talent and my hard work is to serve a higher power, and it's not about me, and therefore I don't have to be so invested in what happens. And then with that, that's where that enthusiasm and perseverance and love that you're talking about comes from. So that's a really nice way. And I think a lot of people can take from that the idea that everything we do can be framed in some way to serve some kind of divine, because at the end of the day, when our human lives are over, we can't take anything with us, really. None of our sort of, I guess I'm literally preaching to the choir here, but any of our possessions and our desires and the things that we want and our money and our status, and none of that stuff goes with you, and all you have is how you've served whatever you believe in, And that doesn't necessarily have to be a god. That could be the universe or love or joy and all of that. So yeah, that was really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question.
I've got I'm quoting you from one of my favorite bits that you said. It was, the more we indulge, the more our desires multiply. The desire is what makes us unhappy. The secret to contentment is the reduction in desire. So my question is that, do you have any advice? I know you said not to cross paths and that you should either go for the worldliness and the desires, or sort of switch on to a God, to connect with God. However, for me, my biology says something different, and I think I struggle to eliminate desires completely. So yeah, do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, another good question. See, there are a few things here. I think we should separate a few strands. One is, I'm not big on spiritual proselytization. There's some people who, when they first take to spiritual life, they get like over enthusiastic about it, like a born again, and then they start preaching it to the world before they've achieved really anything. And I'm really opposed to that. First of all, because that can become another source of ego and even fanaticism and a certain kind of, right? That's a source of spiritual and religious fundamentalism, thinking that your path is better than other people and that you have to bring people into the light, right? Other people are groveling in darkness, and then you're on the inside and you know the right path. But secondly, I think that people need to, I think everybody grows in their own way and evolves in their own way and need their own time to understand things for themselves. And so Sri Ramakrishna used to say, one cannot feel the true spirit of renunciation until one has reached the end of enjoyments. Bhoganto na hole tagashana in Bengali, the original Bengali. That's a profound teaching. The idea is none of us is a tabula rasa when we enter this world as a baby. Each of us has come to this world many times before with all sorts of experiences. And because of that, each of us, when we grow into adulthood, deals with circumstances in very different ways and are at very, very different points in what I call this spiritual marathon. Some of us are at mile 1. Some of us haven't even started the race. Other people are at mile 25. I don't know if it's a 26.2 mile marathon. And the first step is knowing where we stand. We don't have to actually have direct knowledge of our past lives. That's not what I'm talking about, but a general sense of kind of our tendencies, our inclinations, our temperament, personality traits, strengths, and weaknesses. And on that basis, sort of figuring out a spiritual path and philosophy that best works for us. Now, so coming back to this issue, so I feel like, number one, some of us in spiritual life, when we first take to spiritual life, are fueled a little bit by guilt, like this idea that we shouldn't have as many desires as we do. And I don't think that's particularly productive. I think it's worth asking, like, it depends on what the desire is, first of all. And there are like kind of like more and less innocent desires. Innocent from the standpoint of spiritual life. It means that some are just
one in particular, maybe lost.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest problem for almost all spiritual aspirants. And there are many different ways of dealing with lust. Again, partly it's about sort of your temperament, what works best for you. And so, and also it might be that one method might work in a particular day, or a particular time, or in particular circumstances. So it's better to have a kind of arsenal of approaches. So I'll just mention a couple of them. One is prayer, which is very helpful. There's an example from Sri Ramakrishna's own life. Sri Ramakrishna once, suddenly, he's talking about this himself. He says that there's this very, very strong wave of lust that overcame him. The moment he started thinking that, I think by Mother's grace, I've completely overcome lust, this extremely strong wave of lust came. And he explained what he did. He said, I dropped to the floor and started weeping and praying to Divine Mother and said, if it's come to this, oh Mother, then I can't remember the exact words, but he was just basically praying with tears in his eyes to Divine Mother to cure him of it. But there are other ways. Interestingly, his chief disciple, Swami Medhananda, in his teenage years, this very strong wave of lust came, and his response was very different. He became angry at the lust, in a certain, I don't know if angry is the right word, but kind of like, he was like, kind of, not angry, that's not the right word. He became kind of defiant toward the lust and said, he said, what? Almost like addressing lust as like, you think you're going to, overpower me? And he sat on a pile of burning coals sometimes to just kind of put that lust in its place. I mean, it's very interesting. And I think he actually like injured himself for a few days there. But just to kind of like assert his power and mastery over that lustful feeling. But I'll mention a third kind of, so I'm not recommending that as don't go out and sit on burning coals, but just to show you what some saints have done. The third is mindfulness. I think that's very helpful. In chapter 2 of the Gita, there's a beautiful verse for the end, using a very evocative metaphor. Apuryamanam achala pratishtam samudramapa pravishanti yadvat tadvat kama yam pravishanti sarves shantam apnoti na kamakami. Just as a vast infinite ocean, imagine a vast infinite ocean, and when different streams come into that ocean, the ocean's not affected. It's way too large to be affected by these little streams, right? Likewise, the genuine spiritual aspirant is the one who, whenever a stream of desires comes into the vast ocean of their self, they're not troubled by the inflow of those desires. That's a practice of mindfulness, and kind of combined with this Vedantic kind of sakshi bhava, which means this practice of witness consciousness. The idea is let that thought of lust come, but don't give it more power than it deserves. The more you take it seriously, the fatter it gets, and the more serious and problematic it becomes. And so try to take a step back from those lustful thoughts or those desires, and that itself kind of sucks a lot of the power out of that thought. And then a fourth approach is one that Sri Ramakrishna would often recommend when people would come to him with these difficult questions about how do I deal with lust in spiritual life. He would often say, how will you get rid of lust? You don't need to get rid of lust. All you have to do is give that lust a spiritual turn. And you might be puzzled, like, what does it mean to give lust a spiritual turn? He says, turn that lust toward God. If you have to lust after God. Desire God. This is very interesting. And again, I mean, there are very concrete ways that you can, so if prayer isn't working in the moment, listening to a beautiful piece of music, I mean, not pop music, but something that's actually like deeper and more soulful, like spiritual music, sacred classical music, for instance, in the West, which is all about evoking a longing for God, because that's a really nice way of sublimating that worldly lust into something spiritual, a spiritual longing for God. Arvo Pärt, for instance, is one of my favorite. He is my favorite contemporary classical composer because he's a very pious Eastern Orthodox spiritual aspirant, and so all his music has this theme of spiritual longing, which I find very moving. Yeah.
Mm. So it's like, firstly, you acknowledge the lust, and then there's different ways of either channeling it or maybe putting something in front of it to maybe distract you, or you can, the interesting one was to channel it towards God.
Yeah.
I mean, I know, are there, in some religions, I want to say there are gods of lust, so that would be.
No, but I'm not talking about gods of lust. I'm talking about the God. And the moment you turn lust toward God, it's no longer lust. It becomes longing. It becomes this pure devotional longing for God, to realize God.
Right.
So that's the idea behind turning your lust toward God. That lust itself gets transformed the moment you can actually successfully turn it toward God. Because lust is something of the body and mind, right? But longing for God comes from the deeper soul within. So the soul's longing for God is a sort of 180-degree opposite of lust, like the lust that you feel at the level of body mind. But you can sublimate, you can transform that psychophysical lust by turning it towards God, because then it gets transmogrified. And it was like
turning lust to love.
Yeah, exactly. And then another thing I'll say is, this is also just very practical. Often these waves of lust come when you're alone. And so one of the most helpful things to do is talk to other people, because the moment you just have just an ordinary conversation with someone, it could be just like, how was your day? Or they'll start a friend of yours or something. You'll just forget about it after 5 minutes. Or you just watch the news on television or something that helps distract you.
Mm-hmm.
because it's what happens is in that moment, it's like it feels so overpowering, and right. But so the idea is, if you can just think about something else, it'll automatically die a kind of natural death.
Yeah, I can relate to that. It is kind of overpowering, and to kind of put the idea in like it around all these university kids who are maybe indulging in something, and then when I'm on my own, I will feel an increase in lust, and the best way to get out of that is to channel it into love, into something. That'd probably be the most popular way. I think people that I know deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a struggle for growing up as a teenager.
Yeah. Well, that's true of everyone, I would say. So, yes, yeah.
But yeah, it can definitely be kind of a motivator, and you can use it. It's a natural emotion that you can use put into a more positive light.
Absolutely. I think the struggle with lust actually helps us to grow and evolve in many ways from a spiritual standpoint. Something that we actually learned a lot from. In the time, it might feel like, I'll give you an example. Like in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, raises this question: if lust and greed and anger are such selfish qualities, why did God endow us with these qualities? Mm-hmm. And his answer is very succinct and very profound. In order to create saints, one becomes a saint by conquering the senses. This is what he says. It's a very interesting response. God has created us with these selfish qualities like lust and greed and anger in order to make us all into saints in the end. Because it's only through our struggle with our lower tendencies and impulses that we can grow morally and spiritually. That's the idea.
There's also like a reference to lust and these kind of emotions, that they are the lower parts of yourself. They're satisfying the lower parts of yourself.
Well, just ask yourself in the throes of lust, ask yourself who you are. Are you your best self in that moment? And ask yourself also, when you're out of that wave of, then you can think more kind of clearly. What circumstances, what activities, what people bring out my best self? I really think each of us is full of this whole spectrum of selves. And we have our best self, we have better selves, we have a kind of average, ordinary, take it or leave it self, and then there's this really bad self. And I mean, if you inspect yourself carefully, I think most people will have, if they're honest, they'll say, in the throes of lust, you are not your best self. You're probably your worst self, And it's just to look at how much violence is committed because of lust and, all these things and all. So it's kind of obvious, right? But still, recognizing it in yourself and what kind of person do I become in these particular circumstances, in these different circumstances. And then, what's my ideal? What kind of self do I want to identify with most of the time and make my best, my main self? You see what I mean? So if you ask these kinds of questions, I think it actually really helps. Lust is something that's shared with all of the animals, right? I mean, apart from human. So it's not the rational and spiritual side of human nature, right? It's the animal side.
Yeah. Sorry, Jacob. I just want to. I'm quite interested in your own story because, from my understanding, I don't imagine that you were born straight into this path. I mean, you might have been, but I'm not. I don't think that's the case. And I'm very interested in how you came across this way of life and how you went from being sort of living the standard life that human beings live in the material world, in this kind of materialist, individualist society, and then how you came across the path you're on now and how you transitioned and why you transitioned. So could you give me and the listeners a little bit of insight into your own story and how you found this journey?
Sure. I was born and raised in Boston in the U.S. and raised what I would call culturally Hindu, sort of, more than spiritually, which meant my parents would take me to these, what are called pujas, these big religious festivals a few times a year. Durga Puja is one of the big ones. I'm Bengali, and so especially for Bengalis, worship of Durga, Mother Durga, is very popular. But none of that really resonated much with me. So I'd go, there'd be an idol of Divine Mother, there'd be a waving of bells, and nobody explained to me what was going on and why it was significant, what the spiritual meaning of any of this was, why there's so many different deities. That was confusing to me. Is our religion polytheistic or monotheistic? I mean, all these things were coming up and nobody could really answer my questions. At the same time, I should say, there was more of a spiritual, you can say, looking back now, I'm calling it a potentially spiritual influence. My mother has been doing puja, daily worship, private worship of her own, twice a day. She would do it morning and evening every day for, I don't know how many years, 50 or 60 years now. And so growing up, I would see that. I was not particularly interested, and I think I probably looked down on it at the time as a child. But now I really do appreciate that. She just had a genuine devotion, and that goes beyond, going to these cultural festivals and stuff like that. But I ended up, I was just very skeptical and agnostic, and so instead of sitting for the pujas, when I would attend these big religious festivals, I would play football outside with my friends. And by football, I mean few Britishers, American football, yeah. And that was my upbringing. I was a kind of like very skeptical, agnostic seeker, maybe. And then in college, when I went to Berkeley as an undergraduate, I was just very, very interested in religion, spirituality, and philosophy, but without kind of having any sense of direction and whether any of it's true. And if so, which tradition is true? Because I didn't believe in being born into a religion. And so I started reading the Bible, parts of the Quran, Dhammapada, Bhagavad Gita, and it was Gita and Christ's teachings actually that really resonated with me. And the Gita, I was too skeptical to stomach God and devotion and all that, but I loved the idea taught in the Gita again and again that you can achieve fulfillment, true fulfillment and peace only through renunciation of worldly attachments and pleasures. So that was roughly the age of 19 or something and that just strongly resonated with me. And I just had this feeling that I was meant for a monastic vocation. And that was before I read anything about our particular spiritual tradition, the one that I belonged to, Ramakrishna Order. But it was Gita that really first set me on this path, maybe. But I think it really triggered samskaras, mental impressions accrued from previous lifetimes. So I imagine that I was probably a spiritual aspirant of some sort in a previous life. Because I didn't meet swamis when I was growing up. But I had this idea that I want to be a monk in India, actually. That was the idea. It was like a combination of, I have to be a monk in India, a sannyasi. And I went to grad school at Berkeley as well, studying English literature and Western philosophy, especially German philosophy. But within a semester of grad school, I knew that I would finish my PhD, I'd move to India and be a monk. And I'm very open, and so I started telling my friends that. Nobody believed me because I was very academically motivated. We're talking about that, Karma Yoga, this perseverance and enthusiasm. But even though I knew I was going to be a monk after the PhD, that actually it increased my enthusiasm in a way, because I wasn't interested in the ego sides of what I was doing, but I just loved the work, and I had more of a kind of spiritual aim in doing my doctoral work. And then during my PhD, I first read one of Swami Vivekananda's books. I think it was Raja Yoga, and a biography of Swami Medhananda written by Swami Nikhilanji, which I found very inspiring. And so I read, I then ordered the whole 9-volume complete works of Swami Vivekananda, and I read them voraciously as a PhD student in a short period of time. And I started reading the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. And then my ideas about spiritual life and monastic life became much clearer. And I knew that I found the tradition I was looking for. One of the reasons is because it's very broad, and because it doesn't privilege its own spiritual teachings over other religious and spiritual traditions, as many other paths, as far as I can tell, do. And I really like that. And it's not just a piety, but they actually give philosophical justification for their religious pluralism, for their generosity toward other paths. I mean, the idea is that the infinite divine is illimitable. And so you can never say that God is just Christ, or God is just Allah, or God is just Krishna. God lovingly manifests himself or herself. God doesn't even have a gender, and so he can be male or female or neuter. God lovingly manifests to each of us, each spiritual aspirant, in the form that we love. But it's the same God in all cases. And that idea really resonated with me. Because that gave me a way of, I've always liked Christ's teachings, for instance, and Christian, certain forms of Christian spiritual practice, sacred classical music, which is all Christian, Bach and Mozart and Arvo Pärt and all these people I'm talking about. So I still consider that an important part of my spiritual practice, and I consider myself Christian in a certain sense. Even though I'm also Hindu, I'll be more fundamentally Hindu. And so this tradition really helped me to make sense of my spiritual leanings and my openness to other spiritual traditions, and it empowers you to draw from other traditions without becoming superficial, without losing your anchor. Like, it's really important to kind of be firmly grounded in your own home spiritual tradition, but once you're firmly grounded, you can feel free to draw on other spiritual traditions. So that was a really important part of our tradition that I prize. And secondly, the tradition is, and our monastic order in particular, has a very strong emphasis on social service, unlike many other traditional monastic orders in India, where the ideal is just like sort of contemplation and being alone, living alone. Our tradition is, first of all, you're living with other monks, so in a community. But secondly, the motto of our order, coined by Swami Medhananda in Sanskrit, is Atmano Mokshatam Jagadhitaya, which means for one's own enlightenment and for the welfare of humanity. And so social service is an important spiritual practice in our tradition. I find that very helpful and empowering as well. Because just as you, as a high-level wheelchair basketball player, you feel you can think of that as a kind of gift from God. I think that I have certain talents that I really feel can be turned to a spiritual purpose, and so that's what I'm trying to do with my academic work. And I think this actually, you can trace this back to the Gita as well. The Gita had this concept of what's called swat dharma, which means your vocation, your calling, your own law of being. And what Krishna says is, look, Arjuna, he's talking to a warrior. Arjuna, your vocation is to be a warrior and to fight for justice. And by doing that, and by taking the ego out of that work that you're naturally predisposed to do well, that can become a very, very powerful spiritual practice. And so I would say the same thing just about myself, is that I clearly have kind of academic leanings and certain strengths in that area. And there are two ways I could have gone: the preya and the shreya, or the bhoga or the yoga, And so the preya would be doing that academic work, maybe as a professor in the world, but where the ego plays a prominent role. And I've seen this, and I'm not naming names here, but there are academics who are world-class. There's nobody better than them, and yet they're full of ego, and they just seem desperately unhappy. That's the saddest thing. No matter how much academic success they get in objective terms, in worldly terms, they don't seem to be happy for a moment. And there are other academics who are equally impressive, from the standpoint of academic credentials and achievements, but so humble, And so it's a difference in the way that they think about their academic work, even if they're not necessarily card-carrying spiritualists or religious people. And so, yeah, I continue to be an academic philosopher now. I'm writing a book now on karma and rebirth in Hinduism, and I write books and articles. I interact with academic colleagues throughout the world and work on different projects with them, organizing conferences, going to conferences. But I'm doing that. I'm trying to do it as karma yoga. I'm trying to take the ego out of that work, and using the strengths and talents that God has given me to serve God and to serve society to the best of my ability. So that's a short answer, I guess, or not that short answer. Yeah.
No, that's a beautiful story, man. It's really nice to hear, and I love, listening to lots of different interesting people about their stories and how they come to be, the person they are today. What does your sort of typical routine? You gave us sort of your couple of the things you do professionally there, but like, you talked about today, for example, that you got up at 5 a.m. this morning, and like, what does a typical kind of daily practice routine and what is prayer? What was your prayer kind of routine at like times of the day? How long and when do you read scriptures and things like that? Can you give me a bit of details into those kind of things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's no monk is like typical. Every monk will have a different routine with some sort of invariable elements that we all share. Like every monk in our order is expected to meditate twice a day, once in the early morning and once in the evening. Under normal circumstances, it should be roughly an hour, maybe or so. It could be a little longer in the morning, a little shorter in the evening, something like that. Just as a kind of basic framework. Yeah, so in the morning, I wake up and actually I do 12 sun salutations, Surya Namaskars. It's a certain yoga posture, just to kind of get the blood flowing and set the day on the right course. And then I go to meditation, and then we have morning chanting. So you're asking about scriptures, but that's actually built into our practice because we have about a half hour of morning chanting. It depends on the center, but in our center we have a half hour and it's usually Sanskrit chanting, but then we also recite the English translation of the Sanskrit, so people who don't know Sanskrit can also appreciate and understand it. But the Sanskrit language has its own spiritual power, actually. That's why it's important to chant in Sanskrit. In terms of scriptures, I'm both as an academic, but also as a monk, I'm deeply invested in the Vedantic scriptures. And so I read them constantly, and I teach classes on the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, which is the first text, as I said, that turned me on to spiritual life and monastic life. So I have a bunch of copies next to me right now because I'm teaching I'm teaching one class on the Gita at USC, University of Southern California, as a Hindu chaplain there. I'm also teaching a class called Bhagavad Gita in the Light of Sri Ramakrishna. And so teaching these classes gives me an opportunity to kind of go deep into these scriptures and try to relate them to my spiritual life. And I've also memorized the whole Gita and a number of other scriptures. And so I recite chapters of the Gita just to keep that fresh in my mind. So that's also a kind of spiritual practice. Okay, but that's all just like morning and sort of. But yeah, throughout the day, the thing is, in our order, as I said, there's a social service component. And so each of us, depending on our background, our educational training, what center we're at, does a different kind of service, basically, during the day. And so for me, it's actually academic work. It's serving as Hindu chaplain at the University of Southern California and UCLA. It's writing books and articles on Vedanta, on philosophy of religion, on epistemology, philosophy of mind, consciousness, hard problem consciousness, that kind of stuff. But from the standpoint of our Vedantic tradition, attending conferences and stuff like that, giving lectures at different universities. I'm going to go to Duke University in a couple of weeks. I'm going to Harvard in April. And so you might think, well, it doesn't sound like it's spiritual life, but no, that's part of what's unique about our spiritual tradition is that we're breaking down the barrier between sacred and secular, spiritual and worldly. And if you can do that work in a spiritual way, in a spirit of devotion or as a kind of service to humanity or to God, then that itself becomes a very powerful spiritual practice, as I already said, in the context of the Gita. And so that's the idea, is that throughout the day, it's not like I meditate in the morning and then I stop my spiritual practice and then I just do my academic work. The ideal is to transform that daily work itself into a spiritual practice. You can. The challenge for you, for instance, is to transform your athletic activity into a spiritual practice. You see, if you're a student, then the challenge for you, Jacob, right? Yeah, is to transform your studies into a spiritual practice or whatever it is that you're doing. If you have a 9-to-5 job, the struggle is to transform your 9-to-5 job into a spiritual practice. If you have a wife and kids, that needs to be spiritualized. What's your relationship with your loved one, your partner, for instance? that runs the whole range. Some people have an unhealthy codependence with their partner. That's not spiritual. Can you maintain a certain kind of independence of mind and a detachment while being in a very intimate relationship? That's a serious spiritual question, and that's something to work toward. What's your relationship with your kids like if you have children? Is it very clingy? Is your whole life kind of invested just in your kids? And so, whatever, like you don't have a life of your own. That's also not a very spiritual attitude, to be honest. And how overbearing are you with respect to your children? Are you one of those helicopter parents? That's an American term, I think. I don't know if that's used in Britain, but it means like kind of hovering over your children, literally. That's why it's called helicopter parenting. And like not giving them enough breathing space to kind of grow in their own way and to evolve in their own way. So you can analyze literally everything you do. What kind of music do you listen to? Is it all pop music and sort of this kind of, or even if it is, I'm not saying you should stop, but I mean, try to bring in more spiritual forms of music. What kind of films do you watch? What kind of people do you interact with? What kind of friends do you hang out with? All these things are relevant in spiritual life. Yeah.
How would you turn a relationship more spiritual?
Try to bring in. Okay. So if you mean, do you mean like a romantic relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are many ways. I mean, look. I don't want to like scare people off here, but when a householder would come to Sri Ramakrishna, like a married householder would come to Sri Ramakrishna and say, all this stuff you're talking about, burning renunciation, this and that, that's not practical for us. What do we do? And he would give this piece of advice. He would say, after having 1 or 2 children, try to live with your spouse like brother and sister. Okay. Now, even that might be too high-pitched for most people. But look, as I said, you have to understand yourself, where you're at. And it might be, okay, not 1 or 2 children. Nowadays, especially with contraception and all that might not, but the point is, you have to ask yourself, look, if you marry somebody or if you're in a relationship and you consider yourself a spiritual aspirant, if you're honest with yourself, you have to acknowledge that the marriage or that relationship needs to evolve. It needs to evolve in a more spiritual direction eventually. Now, exactly at what pace is something you have to figure out for yourself. But at some point, you're going to need to try to take the lust out of the relationship. That's one thing. Secondly, emotionally, what is your relationship with your partner like? How clingy are you? Do you get jealous if your partner is with other people? Not even necessarily somebody of the opposites, but just, like how much do you think about that person when they're away? How much independence do you have? How much of an independent life do you have away from them? Which is also, I think, important in spiritual life. If can you spend a few days away from your partner without freaking out and becoming an emotional basket case? So, as I said, like avoiding this unhealthy codependence kind of relationship with your partner, that itself is moving in a spiritual direction. How selfish are you in the relationship? To what extent? Swami Medhananda was scathing about some of the relationships he saw, and he said that most of the time it's what he called sanctified shopkeeping, which means I do this for you, but I'm expecting this in return. And that's fundamentally selfish. And to what extent is that playing a role in your relationship with your partner, with your loved one, with your kids? It doesn't have to be a romantic partner. It could be a kid, To what extent are you raising your kid and sacrificing your own time and certain aspects of yourself for that kid? But with the expectation that the kid is going to reciprocate in the future or even then, right? There's a lot of that shopkeeping that goes on in these kinds of relationships. So try to take that shopkeeping, that kind of tit for tat, quid pro quo kind of attitude, which is basically selfish and egoistic, take it out of that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, it comes back to kind of being at an equal level with your partner as well.
Absolutely.
Because I think a lot of mistakes happen where someone is where ego does get in the way, and that's the common theme of kind of this call. But that's when ego gets in the way of a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think that's one that should be the most defining.
Well, this reminds me of a great book by C.S. Lewis. It was actually a Christian friend of mine when I was at Oxford University, when I was in the midst of debating with people, religious people and atheists and whatever. And he gave me this book. I'm grateful to him, Chris. His name is Chris. And C.S. Lewis makes this beautiful distinction between 4 kinds of love, and I'm just mentioning 2 of it. He says, in an erotic relationship, the relationship is face-to-face, and in the love of you're side by side. And I really like that contrast in that metaphor. Try to cultivate an attitude of being side by side, even with your romantic partner. That would be moving in a spiritual direction, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Rather face-to-face, claustrophobic, kind of like it's you and me and forgetting about the rest of the world, right? But
it's more of that kind of my other half metaphor, and the 2 of you coming together to make a whole, and that idea. I also wanted to ask you, what was your first day like as a monk? How are you introduced into the monk world?
Well, there's a reason why I wanted to join in India, because I wanted like the authentic, traditional kind of monastic life. And so, it's a pretty rigorous routine, because they expect you to wake up at about 3:10 in the morning and attend morning meditation at 4 in the morning in the main temple. And so just like adjusting to that was difficult. Just waking up that early, because I just wasn't used to waking up that early. And sitting for meditation and not falling asleep. And
so was it quite overwhelming and a lot going on? Was it overwhelming and different?
No, it wasn't. I mean, just because I think I'd already told you that. I mean, I'd been wanting to be a monk for a number of years before that, and I was at the point where, toward the end of my grad studies, when I was about to finish my PhD, I was so fed up with the Western clothes I was wearing, the pants and shirt, that I was just dying to just give it away to Goodwill charity, and I was so fed up with materialism and just the ordinary way of living. So I was looking forward to becoming a monk, and just like, good riddance. That was the feeling when I first joined. It was not actually like, I wouldn't say it was difficult in the sense of like transitioning away from worldly life to, it's not the doubt about it. It was more about like, I could like breathe a sigh of relief in a way. That's
the other people there, were they sort of quite welcoming, and they teach you stuff, and last sort of couple of weeks?
Yeah. Well, I should explain something about our order, about like kind of the nuances of joining our order, if anybody's interested. We have centers throughout the world, and each of our centers has a different focus or emphasis. In India, because it's still a developing country, a lot of our work is focused on serving the community in different ways. And so we have charitable hospitals, we have schools. I joined at a university. Our order runs a university called Vivekananda University, and I chose to join there. I was the first novitiate to join at this university. It was back in 2010, sorry. And so my work was academic work. I was a professor and the head of the program in philosophy there, but as a monastic novitiate and trying to do it as a spiritual practice. And yeah, the head there, Swami Medhananda, was very supportive and encouraging. And so, yeah, it depends on where you join. And so if you join in a hospital center, you're going to be working in the hospital and maybe working in hospital administration, serving patients, possibly if you're a doctor, if you're trained as a doctor, for instance. Yeah, so it really depends on different things. But because of that service component, it didn't feel as jarring as it might otherwise have, because I was trained as an academic, and then I was still doing the academic work, but trying to put it on a more spiritual footing.
Mm. Yeah, me and Joe, we want to get more into spirituality. Well, I'm saying that on our behalf, but I'm guessing you do as well, Joe. So we've talked about the idea of going on like a meditation retreat to start, and I would actually like to see a monastery and see what it's like, because it's a really interesting way of life, and I think it's like you talk. It's a different kind of fulfillment as well.
Yeah.
I've always thought of success in the material world as what I want to fulfill me, but there's I think you're a different kind of fulfilled spiritually.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, here at the Vedanta side of Southern California in Hollywood, where I'm based, we have a monk for a month program, and so you can come, and people do come. And
What's that? A monk for a month?
Yeah, monk for a month program. Yeah, yeah,
That'd be great.
so you hang out and you live like us, and you follow the same routine, and you serve the ashrama, the monastery, the community in a certain way by cooking, helping at the kitchen, and doing some other things, whatever. And you can attend the classes and lectures, the meditation. So yeah, that's always a possibility. Yeah, you're welcome.
And when you meditate, it's kind of like someone's guiding through a practice, right?
No, well, but not real time, but you have a guru who initiates you into a certain meditation practice and a certain mantra, and then you do it on your own. And if you have questions and your guru's still alive, you can ask your guru questions or about your struggles, challenges, difficulties.
I want to ask, why do you not feel like, why do you feel like this world that we live in, the material world, why do you think it doesn't value the spiritual path? And why do you think, as human beings, the majority of us get led astray? And do you think it is the fact that, like we were saying earlier, our kind of lower selves, those lower drives, can be so overpowering, and people for basically the majority of their lives get stuck in the whims of those lower selves? And do you think the lack of value for that kind of monastic, deeply spiritual way of living is why there is a lot of sort of mental health crisis, especially in the developed kind of Western world? Like, what do you think of kind of all those factors and how they interact?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Look, like the ego is just so pervasive, and most people are just fully in the grip, so fully in the grip of ego that they don't even know it, right? That's part of the problem, is that they don't know their own predicament. And at a societal level, I think capitalism plays a large role, because capitalism thrives on selfishness and ego and consumerism, right? I mean, it's like, you just ordered a pan. Here are 5 more pans, and they want you to buy more. And right. And these algorithms are designed in a way to keep giving you more of what you want. Social media is designed in the same way. So consumer culture, capitalism, social media, all these things are conspiring to strengthen and gratify our egos rather than to challenge them, right? Pop culture, pop music, everything is crushingly oriented toward making us more needy, desirous, selfish, more, because then the capitalist structures will benefit, businesses will thrive. And I've seen this because I'm a monk, and so some people are almost personally offended by the fact that I'm a monk, and that's an interesting reaction. I'm not saying most people, but I'm saying some people. You just look at their face, and they're like, because they see me as talented in certain worldly ways, like I'm academically, I have my academic credentials. I did a PhD at a good university, and I'm still writing these books and stuff. And they're like, well, why did he become a monk? And so I think partly that's fueled by guilt sometimes. And some of these people, like, what does he know that we don't? Or Yeah, it's the path less trodden, right? And so and there's a reason for that, because it's just it's difficult to live a life oriented away from materialism and selfishness. And I'm not saying I'm completely selfless and unselfish, but I'm on the path. So yeah, I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but or maybe you want to
add to that. Well, change it slightly, but I think the world is very dopamine orientated, and
so what were you getting? What'd you say?
Dopamine.
Dopamine oriented. Yeah. I mean, I've given some talks on this too. Yeah, you've read a book, I think, Dopamine Nation. Have you read that?
I haven't. Have you, Joe?
Is that by I haven't read it. Is that by the researcher Anna Lemke from from Stanford?
Yeah, from Stanford. Yeah, I give a lecture called "Of Mice and Marshmallows," which you can check out on YouTube. But it's about but go ahead. Yeah, please.
And the problem with dopamine, if I'm correct, Joe, is like when you get a big hit, then you come crashing down and it comes lower than your base level, and so that would explain the mental health problems at the moment, because everyone's getting lower and lower down in his base level, but maybe the better path would be the serotonin.
Well, I think, yeah. What you're trying to say is sort of the way the dopamine system in the brain works is when you gratify yourself to a high degree, they've been rapidly increasing in the brain, and then it falls, and if it's a massive increase, it will fall kind of just below baseline. That's why we get this feeling of kind of like brain fog when we indulge in instant gratification and things. And I feel like maybe that's why people get hooked to sort of drugs and sources of dopamine and stuff, because they're always trying to chase that peak. And when they feel that drop below baseline, that gives them that withdrawal and that hunger. But what I found quite interesting that you said about how people aren't even aware of their own predicament with things. I think, and this might just be the circles that I'm walking in, but I'm interested to see what you think of this. There does seem to be in certain individuals a deep longing for the spiritual life. But they do not know how to actualize it, and they do not know how to get there, and they do not want to take the leap of getting rid of everything that they have and everything that they know and everything that they think they are, and this is because they are still, their ego is still holding on as tight as it possibly can while they're trying to shrug it off. And I mean, you can even just see it in me and Jacob as two 19-year-old men from England, that like the world we're brought up in is completely the opposite to the life that you lead, but yet we're here on a Wednesday evening having this conversation. Is that I think there are people, there is a longing there, and there is a desire deep within us, and I think it takes a certain temperament, like you said, and that might be to do with past lives and experiences our soul has had, that there are some who are able to take that leap. I mean, that's quite interesting.
No, I think that's right, and I also think I'll just add that as Swami Medhananda used to say, suffering is the great eye opener. And he also said the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. And I've got friends I had a good friend, still a good friend, who was an alcoholic and was miserable, but at the same time didn't really know it and was just addicted to alcohol and harming both himself and others in the process until he hit rock bottom. And he told me that the day he walked into AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, for the first time, he said he had this white light moment when he just surrendered his ego to the divine. And it sometimes takes hitting rock. He was in a motorcycle accident, like all sorts of stuff. But I think for a lot of people, as you said, I really think you're right, that there is this fundamental longing for something higher in pretty much everybody. And that's the longing of the soul. But the problem is we don't listen to our soul. The ego is so strong in most of us, and we're not even aware of the soul's needs and its longing. But that we get these glimpses in these moments of crisis, terrible suffering. Sometimes it's moments of transition in life when we become we're forced to become more reflective and thoughtful about ourselves and where our life is going. And sometimes, often, unfortunately, it takes tremendous suffering to get there.
Like God's forgiveness, maybe.
Yeah, God's forgiveness, a certain kind of like giving up, like saying like my entire life up till now has been based on ego, and that's just not leading, it's not going anywhere, and I'm miserable. and just acknowledging that to yourself. What precipitates that exactly is that depends on the individual. And sometimes it is triggered by things from past lives. But in many cases, it's something in this life, like they rush headlong into whatever worldly path they're on. And it's only after having a huge crash that they come to that insight. And one thing, just to follow up about the previous thing we were talking about, I think it's really important in the context of dopamine and all that. Part of what is so challenging in contemporary society is that the whole culture is oriented toward instant gratification of various kinds. And if you're interested, I give a lecture here in Hollywood called Vedanta in an Age of Instant Gratification, talking about all this stuff. As I said, social media algorithms on which these social media websites are developed are all about instant gratification, giving you more instant gratification of exactly what you're looking for. If you like hearing right-wing news, then they're going to give you that algorithm's going to spit out 100 more videos of the same thing. Pornography works the same way, and and I think this age is unprecedented in a way. It's an unprecedented age of instant gratification because of smartphones and because of the internet. So we can get whatever we want in whatever quantity we want, whenever we want, in a way that is unprecedented. And I don't think our minds, our brains and bodies are equipped to handle this. I think the longitudinal studies haven't been done yet just because we haven't even lived in the age of the internet long enough. I mean, I think they're starting to come out, but like the long-term effects of this extreme exposure to instant gratification, where people who would otherwise, like in the 90s or 80s if they lived, they wouldn't be constantly watching pornography, but because of modern technology, it's so easy to slip into to succumb to those temptations. So we live in an unprecedented age of instant gratification and temptation that's very, very difficult and challenging for spiritual aspect.
And monks, I want to say, have the highest happiness rates among all humans, and there's absolutely no instant gratification there. So I think there's something in that kind of proves that delaying gratification is the way.
Well, sorry, I just want to add that, like, to me, what that says is that pleasure and the good feeling you get from indulging in a material world, and like we can perceive those, if we're not aware, as positive things, in inverted commas, are completely different to the positive that is deep fulfillment found through delaying gratification and through like giving yourself up and devoting yourself to sort of a higher power,
Absolutely. And I'd quote this is one of my favorite verses from this text called 100 Verses on Detachment, Vairagya Shatakam, Sanskrit. Satu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishada manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridra. That person is poor and miserable and unhappy, whose desires are great. When the mind is contented, who is rich and who is poor? So it gives it a completely different way of thinking about wealth and fulfillment and happiness. And on the other hand, misery and poverty. And so that person is miserable and poor. You can be an Elon Musk and have billions of dollars and be miserable and unhappy and unfulfilled. Why? Because even with that $10 billion, now you're hanging with people who have hundreds of billions of dollars, and you're still full of desires. You have 4 yachts, but your friend has 8 yachts, and so now you need 10 yachts. And that person, that monk, who lives on alms, say, I mean, in one extreme of monastic life, that's not us, but in any case, people who live from begging for food and all that, that person can be much happier than the multi-billionaire. Why? Because that person's happy with what he or she has. You see? Mm-hmm. I think that's an important part of it, is just being content with what you have, and not like manufacturing new desires unnecessarily, because I think that's part of what capitalism and this whole culture of instant gratification is deeply invested in, is making us think, hypnotizing us into thinking that we need X, Y, and Z, when in fact we don't. Right? So we have to be very careful about distinguishing needs from desires. Do we really need that 5th pair of shoes, or is it Amazon's algorithm that keeps telling me that I need it?
Mm. Yeah, it's like you said, desires never stop. There's always going to be the next desire. Yeah. Shit. Well, kind of like enjoyment in the simple things as well. I think that's a good lesson to take, because the simple things are there for a reason, and we don't actually need anything else.
Yeah, I mean, Anna Lemke, she gives an example from her book, Dopamine Nation, where she talks about a Stanford, I think, undergraduate student who is addicted to social media, suffering from depression, I think anxiety and stuff like that. And Anna Lemke tells her, when you walk to campus in the morning, what do? She says, well, on the phone, I think she's either listening to music or using social media on her smartphone. And Dr. Lemke said, don't do that. Just stop. Just don't be completely unplugged as you walk to campus, and just sort of see what's around you and just, be with yourself. And she freaked out. She was like, how can I do that? But then she agreed. And the first day or something was really awful for her. She just felt really bored. And then she said, after a few days, she said, I started noticing the trees, the simple things, and it's a beautiful way of putting it. And she automatically just started feeling better when she started unplugging. I'm a jogger. And so I'm people think I'm weird because when I jog, I don't have any earbuds in. I don't listen to music. But I'm fortunate enough to be, our ashrama is in the foothills of the Hollywood Hills, and we have these beautiful hills with breathtaking views. Why do I need to put in something into my ears or listen to music or whatever it is, when you can appreciate nature and see the divine manifest in the natural world?
What I found is I did a meditation a couple of days ago, and I had two things that kind of happened that very surprised me. One of them was that I could hear outside, I took a lot more notice straight away of the birds around me and the environment around me. But also before that meditation, I was maybe slightly sad. And so after I did that, I felt so much better. And so it's like meditation as a kind of healing. Would you say so?
Yeah, and it's restorative in a certain way. It's restoring us to our natural, pristine state. I think the problem is this whole culture is saturated with ways to make us identify with our artificial, more superficial self. And so just doing simple things like communing with nature, going on a hike, talking to a friend, but actually talking without actually looking at your smartphone the whole time. And, a few years ago, I was in Japan and I was at a restaurant and I just saw this mother with her teenage kids. And she's just sitting there helplessly, and both of them are just on their phones playing computer games or just whatever they're doing. And I just found it sad.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really don't like is what I didn't like when I worked at restaurants is I just see people around the table and they're not interacting, they're just on their devices. Yeah. I found it quite sad. Yeah. iPad kids is a new phrase that how next Gen Z's kind of coming up and stuff. And I think to conclude what you're saying there is what we were talking about last week, Joel, where it's it's not what you look at, it's what you see.
That's a nice way of putting
it. Yeah. That's everything I've got on, unless you've got any more questions, Joel. It'd be a good place to end.
Yeah, I'm just hugely grateful to have such a wise person in our presence and able to teach us youngsters some stuff about life and about spirituality. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to us.
Thank you so much, Jacob and Joel. This was a really fun conversation. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. I mean, this is an unusually thoughtful podcast interview, so I really appreciate that. I've done quite a bit of them, and this is great. Thank you.
Would you ever become like a guru? Is that the next step up?
We don't believe in stuff or down or any of that stuff. And I mean, it is possible for a few monks in our order to become a guru. Like the head of our center here in Hollywood is a guru. But that's something that you're given authorization from the authorities. And Yeah, I have absolutely no interest in becoming a guru. That's another big danger in spiritual life is because there's a saying in India, which is everybody wants to be a guru. Nobody wants to be a disciple. So we don't even think about those things.
Well, we'll put links to your lectures and talks that people can find at the bottom of this episode if anyone's interested.
They're really good, your lectures. I watched about 1.5, and yeah, I really like the deception one.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the work you're doing is very useful, and I hope it reaches the people I need it.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you, Matt.
All right. Likewise. Take care.
See you later.